Is it working?
I don't know, is it working?
Can you hear me? Can you hear?
All right.
Awesome. So Margaret, Ron, thank you. Thank you. Working too good.
A little too much feedback, yeah.
So I don't know if the audience knows you. I know, Ron, you were just speaking downstairs. So why don't you just spend a minute or two and just introduce yourself to the audience and tell them what you're focused on.
I'd love to do that. So Margaret Alston, I work for a company called TrustArc, and we get to sit and think about privacy all day long. So we have technology and consulting services, which is the team that I lead. And certainly technology is an interesting thing for privacy because technology is data-driven, and personal data is what privacy is all about. So I'm glad to be speaking here today, so thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's see if, no, so I can't use this mic because it gives feedback if we're, yeah, you know.
Call an audible.
Do we want to switch so it's easier to pass the mic back and forth?
That's a good idea. Why don't I sit there?
So I'm Ron Bodkin. I'm in the CTO office for Google Cloud. My focus is artificial intelligence and analytics. So I both work with customers around applying these technologies as well as working with our product teams and researchers around, what are we investing in. I spoke earlier about responsible AI because I think really important theme is thinking about how do we get the best results out of AI. There's so much potential. We're doing so much at Google, and I see customers, so many companies in industry benefiting from it, but with great power comes great responsibility.
Thank you. So these are topics that are really big in conversation today, right? I see it all the time in news articles. I see it all the time. I hear it all the time in conference rooms. One of the things I'm just curious about from your perspective, there is definitely a relationship between the value that artificial intelligence will bring to somebody and the trade-off between things like data privacy, security, ethics, and the consumer's perception of the value that gives to them. Can you give me your thoughts just kind of initially on what you think that, how you think that relationship works? Does it work today? Is this something that we should be discussing at length, or is it too early?
I don't at all think it's too early, and if you'd asked me this maybe 5 years ago, I would have said yes. And the reason I don't think it's too early now is because it really helps to have concrete use cases to talk about, right? And I think that maybe 5 or 10 years ago, it was a theoretical exercise. We were learning. We didn't have the masses of data anyway, right, that we do today to help AIs learn and be productive, and the AI industry wasn't evolved enough to be really useful in a practical sense. So we didn't have use cases to think about. Well, let's think about this, and what are the implications, and is there a balance, right? The right balance between privacy and the benefits that we get. But now I think we're starting to get those real live situations to think about, which really helps us do that in a smart way.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think that we're getting we're getting more sophistication, right? There's more awareness that privacy is important, right? I think part of it is the importance also of having more explicit control and trade-off. That people are willing to share data and give up some privacy in return for benefits, but it's important that it be based on transparency and trust, right? I think there's a healthy movement towards regulation and towards more explicit unbundling, giving people more control, more granular control, right? It shouldn't be like, to use any of our services, you need to give us unlimited rights to all your data. That's the extreme, right? But we're moving away from that to a world of more like, hey, I'd like to have control, right? Like, maybe I don't want you to keep my location history forever, but for 90 days, and that's enough for what I want to do, and that's a better trade-off for me. I think another thing that's an important area of research, and an important area to be thinking about too, is like, how do we get more benefits from artificial intelligence without having to share as much data, right? So, we're investing in technologies like federated learning and differential privacy, which make it easier to do things like learn something for a user on their phone, and it doesn't have to go to a cloud and be collected at all, right? So I think we should be investing in getting more benefits with less use of data and more privacy. So I think that's an important theme too.
And how about some examples that you both think that are really relevant to talk about right now that present ethical or dilemmas with privacy that you think we should be talking about right now? Are there specific examples that you can name?
Yeah, maybe one I'll bring up is recently an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal said reported that Amazon's product search had been pushed towards favoring products that were Amazon made over what users were tending to be interested in, right? And that's an example, if true, right? Obviously Amazon has not commented on this article, but if that's true, right, that's a great example of, in my mind, a problematic case where you're applying machine learning to manipulate users, right, to buy something that's in your interest and is against their interest, right? So that would be an example to me of a kind of harm that could come about from machine learning that we don't want to see, right? It's a kind of violation of trust.
Margaret, how about you?
Totally agree. And, it's interesting that even 7-10 years ago, a major retailer had an incident where they understood what people were buying in their store and amassed that information. They did marketing, right, based on that, and they actually sent, in those days it was postal mail, so sent a postal mail to a household, and it was geared at, they believed that that there was a young person there who was pregnant. And they actually knew had happened to be a teenage girl. And the father found out after the fact, and so the major retailer, right, knew before the family knew that the kid was pregnant, and so it's those kinds of things where no laws were broken, right? The company was doing what you would expect a company to do, to know their customers and be really good at amassing data and targeting ads and doing activities that are interesting to that person, but there's certainly some unintended consequences when you gather together a lot of information where that organization might know more about somebody than the people around that person, and even that person might want them to.
And maybe just one more, because I think an area that comes up a lot and is important to think about too is unintended bias, right? So that's another kind of harm, right? That you see things like, there was a recent study that showed racial discrimination in machine learning models from fintechs in providing high, basically African Americans and Latinx loan applicants were paying higher basis points for interest on their mortgages. And I think the estimate they came up with was $750 million a year of extra interest being paid by discriminated against groups, right? From what it was apparently an objective model, but in fact had some hidden bias built in. And there's lots of those kinds of examples, right? So bias is something that often comes up as a problematic issue in machine learning models.
Yeah, I heard about I heard the story.
Right.
Yeah, it's shocking. You can imagine the parents' reaction.
And from years ago, right, when we didn't have the data that we do today. So.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. How about, on the flip side of this, how about examples of where you don't think we should be concerned about privacy issues with artificial intelligence or concerns with ethics and biases, and is there an alternate side of that story where you should just let innovation run?
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, from a privacy perspective, we're only concerned about data when it can be linked back to an individual. And as AI gets better and we get better collectively at truly de-identifying data, then we can pull really, really useful information without understanding that this is linked to a person. It can still help the AI learn and be applied in a good way. So, we hear words about blockchain, and there are some technologies and techniques that we can use to help truly de-identify data. I don't think that means we shouldn't worry about it, right? But I think that we're moving forward in a direction that's productive and privacy sensitive. One of the hard things about de-identification is the smarter you get, the smarter you also are on being able to re-identify data. So that's why I say it's not something we should not worry about, but I'm encouraged at the direction that we're taking along those lines.
Ron, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so certainly on the de-identification point, there's been a number of prominent failures in past when people released de-identified data sets believing that it would all work out well, and then of course smart researchers figured out how to identify people in those data sets to great embarrassment, right? Like way back in the Stone Ages, AOL released some search data that was re-identified in that way. But I'd say broadly, there's tons of value, right? There's so much good that can be done, like in your example of medical applications of AI. But I think we always need to be thoughtful and careful when we're making big changes because there always are unintended consequences. Even the most benign positive things, you can find surprising effects, right? Like improving productivity for people. What are the unintended consequences of that, right? So there's lots of wonderful things happening from machine learning and good use of data. But I think we should be responsible whenever we're innovating and making changes in how we do things.
Well, okay, so to that point, I mean, there are plenty of examples of where things can go wrong. There are lots of examples of where things can go right. Like, how does someone in the audience tell the difference? Do you have any advice for them?
Well, no, go ahead.
I think it's like one of the things that we've done at Google is we've built in governance around privacy and AI. So you have, as part of a process when you're rolling things out, you have a review and you consider it. And sometimes it may be relatively straightforward to say, hey, there's not an issue here. We're pretty clear that what's going to happen and it's good, and this is how you might monitor it. In other cases, it can be more nuanced, right? So to me, it starts with a governance process and reviewing things.
Makes sense. Totally makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree. And certainly in the technology industry, a lot of companies are thinking through what they call privacy by design or privacy by default. So they're designing their systems from the beginning to be privacy sensitive, and it doesn't address all ethical issues, but certainly from a privacy perspective, it's a positive step. And I think just from a practical standpoint, the sniff tests that we'll often use in companies that are trying to make these what can be really hard decisions about what's the right thing to do and how to design something in the right way is to think first, would I be comfortable with this happening to my data? Yes or no? But everybody is different, right? People there's a sliding scale of righteousness for privacy, and everybody thinks of it differently. So we don't generally stop there. We generally ask, well, would my mother be comfortable with her data being used in this way? And then also think about, would my kids be comfortable, and think about the vulnerable data subject groups that you might have, and try to think through whether they would be comfortable, whether there would be a fear factor there, and also through the unintended consequences or the possible bad paths for those vulnerable groups especially. And usually you can come up with the right answer with those sniff tests.
Margaret, those are great points, and I think one way of thinking about it is more generally, right? Like user-centric design and really thinking about the user and having principles for how you incorporate the user's needs is a really important way of thinking about this. Privacy for artificial intelligence, teaching people good practices is really important. And another thing is just diversity, right? Like one of the great things, if you have more diverse people involved in a product, you get diverse perspectives, right? I think we all, when we have too narrow a group of people working and we lack a lot of, cultures or backgrounds, it's easy to get it wrong.
Well, let's shift a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about legislation and policy. This is a really fun, exciting topic. What is your opinion on regulation at this stage with artificial intelligence? Do you think it's needed? And data privacy as well, but do you think it's needed? Is it premature? Is it effective? Just let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's there are already regulations. For example, in the European Union's GDPR privacy regulation, that, for example, say that a person has a right to appeal an algorithmic decision, right? So there's a little bit of regulation that's already come in place, and likewise, there's regulation in certain industries around how decisions might be made algorithmically. So there's already some, and I think, you know, the general trend is it's still pretty early on. I like the European Union's approach where they put forward trustworthy AI-like guidelines for comment, so it's not yet a regulation, but it's part of spurring a conversation towards how do we have a thoughtful approach to regulating. You know, I think that I generally, you know, I don't speak for Google in terms of what Google advocates for regulation, but I'll put on, you know, my personal hat and say that I like, you know, ideas around like how do you have the right public-private partnerships. So I worry about how quickly regulation can keep up with fast-moving changes in industry. So I think, you know, examples are like from FINRA, where you say, hey, maybe you have private consortium that is able to move faster, but still write regulations with legislative backing. You know, those kinds of models are interesting to me, right? Because I think we have to think about how we adapt regulation to a very fast-moving landscape and not be hopelessly far behind and still be highly relevant.
Yeah, I love that example that you gave, and I totally agree. It's interesting to see the laws come out because this is a hot time for privacy, certainly, and it seems like almost every day a new privacy law comes out around the world, and it's interesting to see the flavor of what people want to see, right? And I think that generally it may be a little behind, a step behind, but you know, policy follows what people are concerned about, right? Or bad things that happen, and then we create a law to try to prevent that in the future. And the automated decisioning rules that apply in Europe and also in Canada and some other areas, what these rules do is that I think they reflect a fear that we have that that good ethical decisions. It's a belief that good ethical decisions are contextual, and we worry that a machine can't handle that contextual kind of area, right? And so we put protections around that. If you make important decisions about people without human intervention, then you have to do a lot more things to make that okay, right? Because there's some special vulnerability that you have when a machine is making decisions about you without a human being involved, because in the past, you know, machines haven't been able to do a good job of that kind of contextual work. And what I propose is that's good for now, but if we're making predictions, right, in the future, you know, maybe we'll get to the point where machines can make better contextual decisions than human beings, and we'll have a flip rule that says, well, if a human being is involved in an important decision about someone, you need to put additional protections in place, right, to guard against the bad outcome. So I think it's interesting to see the different types of rules that are coming out, and I think that the privacy laws that are on the books now are appropriate and reflect the bad things that happen. So even if you look across a heat map for the world for privacy regulation, you know, some countries are like in the EU are more protective and others are less protective. It's interesting that the U.S. is kind of the big cold spot, right, for developed nations for privacy laws. But even in the United States, 50 states have breach notification laws, right? So that says that we are worried about our personal data that gets out in the wild and is misused. So I don't think it's too early to have laws, but I wouldn't like to see it on AI specifically. But I think the privacy laws, at least, that help protect us when our data is being used in whatever ways, including through machines, that we have some additional protections.
Do you think policy is enough? I'm curious. Like, you know, you mentioned the future and what laws might be coming or what might be needed in the future. But do you think that policy is enough, or is there something else that might be needed to help keep people safe or keep their data safe or keep things ethical? Is there something else you think?
You know, it's an interesting question. I kind of relate that to a company culture, right? A company will usually have policies and internal policies and procedures that say you may not surf porn on the internet, you know, whatever those internal policies are. And there can be a big difference between what the internal policies say and what people actually do. So it's kind of the do-say ratio within a company. And I think that company culture plays a huge role in, do we really do the right thing with privacy, or do we just have policies that we kind of follow but not really, and don't, you know, they're just a door stop, right, to keep the door open. And I equate that in the public, you know, legislative world as well. I think we can have laws on the books, but if people don't really care, and we don't have as a country, as a globe, a culture that is interested in really protecting people and personal data and kind of ethical implications of AI, then the policies probably aren't enough. But I hope that the policies will help keep the rogue folks, you know, from doing really terrible things, and we're together building a global culture of understanding and protecting against the risks.
Yeah, I think those are great points. You know, I'd add, I think there's a lot of room for, a lot of organizations are really trying to get their head around, like, how do you act in a way that's responsible? How do you invest? How do you train people? How do you have the right kind of governance, right? A lot of times it's, people are just becoming aware and then wanting to understand how do they take action, right? So I think making those investments, making it easier is part of the answer. I think, you know, as well as regulation. The other thing I see happening that's encouraging is I see a lot of people acting, you know, responsibly as individuals, right? Saying, hey, you know, I'm not comfortable with this, and I don't want to work at a company that their values are this. I want to be at a, you know, I think one of the great things about, you know, the younger cohorts in the workforce is there's a strong tendency to want to find purpose in work and seek out organizations that comply with their values, right? And I think you're seeing some great outcomes from that in terms of bigger companies having employees say, hey, we're not comfortable with this stance, this ethical stance. You know, in the field of AI, you know, you see organizations where the use of face recognition software is creating, you know, concern, right? Or it may be around how it might be applied, right? So, you know, I think those are that. It's a conversation in society, and there's a lot of factors that have to come together.
Now, this is a conference about innovation, and so one of the things that I'm also conscious of, I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about, is like we're talking about ethical issues, we're talking about privacy issues, which tend to put constraints on what you can and cannot do. But I'm curious, do you think that policy is affecting innovation right now? And should it be?
I think that in terms of privacy, the privacy laws are aimed at data, which is kind of the fuel and the in some ways the output of AI, and I don't think that privacy right now is a naysayer. I don't think that it's holding things back in terms of innovation. In fact, I might propose that some of the really coolest innovations I've seen have been in support of privacy, right? We know we've had innovations that have helped us, you know, leverage the right tools to protect people's data and avoid the negative outcomes. So while it may slow down the access to some types of data that might fuel, I don't think that it's slowing down the development itself.
I mean, I think that there's both sides of the coin, right? I think there's interesting places where this can be an impetus for innovation itself, right? The changing awareness and consumer desires mean that thinking about privacy and how to win trust of customers and how to do things, you know, use AI in a way that really complies with users and their values is a big opportunity, right? So I think some of this is it's just part of the landscape is changing, and what matters to people is changing. In the same way that if you think about environmentalism, how companies started to innovate around being environmentally conscious was not only good for the planet, but also good for business, right? So I think it becomes a new area for innovation. But I think it is true that, you know, being responsible and thoughtful about consequences sometimes is a brake on innovation. It's a necessary brake, right? Rather than sort of racing ahead and doing things and then creating carnage in the wake, right? We do need to slow down. You know, the expression "move fast and break things" has lost a lot of popularity in the last couple of years.
Well, and to that point, there are a lot of leaders in the room here. You know, what would be your advice to them on how to think about governance and oversight, especially if they're experimenting with artificial intelligence, or things that they should be very conscious of in terms of data privacy that, you know, as they move forward and run out there and innovate?
Well, I think the main point that I would make is one we've already touched on, which is look at things from the data subject's point of view and try to work through, you know, how would I want this to be done on me and my mother and my kids and the vulnerable groups, right, this might touch. And it's interesting, and I think
many of you asked for the slides. We will distribute those slides. I think we might have to get permission from a few people, but some of the speakers said that we can go ahead and distribute those slides to the people who asked for them, or the people who are in attendance for today. And also a big thank you to all of you for coming out and helping us test out a new format of really looking at innovation differently, and looking at it from a practical standpoint and looking at it from multi-industry standpoint as well. I know I gained a lot of nuggets from today and things that I could utilize and think differently about how I actually do things, and hopefully you have done that too. But with that, we have a reception out in the lobby for you, and hopefully it won't take you very long to get home wherever you may be going. Okay, but thank you again. Bye-bye.